Welcome to Let's Talk Wit and Wisdom, a presentation of parents' findings. I want to thank you for watching. There's a quote that reads, "Three things cannot be long hidden, the sun, the moon, and the truth." And it's my hope that this presentation will help you to find the truth that you may be looking for. About Moms for Liberty. This is the Williamson County chapter, part of a national organization that was founded January of this year. The Williamson County chapter was founded April 6th of this year, and we presented our first CRT 101 on the 19th of May to a crowd of 450. This Let's Talk Wit and Wisdom is our second presentation. We formed in an effort to shine a light on the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspirations of Williamson County schools. During that journey, we became aware of issues with the elementary curriculum. Therefore, we formed a Wit and Wisdom deep dive team and have been working since May of 2021 to get to the bottom of the curriculum. And more than 15 parents have invested more than 1,200 hours into this effort, and we're still going. Myself, I'm Robin Steenman. I'm the head of the Williamson County chapter. I'm ex-military and a full-time mom and a resident of Williamson County. What we're covered today, the intro, who we are, also terminology that will be used in the discussion of curriculum, a review of the curriculum, a brief touch on critical race theory, and also how the curriculum was adopted. For terminology, there's a lot of words going around these days, but we'll hit on a few of them. Social emotional learning. May not be specifically acquainted with this word, but you'll know it when you hear it. It's teaching your child how to, quote, cope with feelings, manage emotions, develop identities, feel and show empathy, which is a vast departure from the standard reading, writing, and arithmetic. Next terminology, critical race theory. Quite simply, critical race theory is the division of students along racial lines. Individuals are divided into oppressor and oppressed groups based on their skin color. Lexile. Lexile is a number anywhere from 25 to over 1,200 that's assigned to a student's reading level. The higher the lexile, the higher the student's reading level. It's also assigned to the books. Books are also given lexile numbers in order to match that student to the correct book. Lexile does not pertain to the age level of the reading topic, however. Trauma-informed pedagogy, also called trauma-informed teaching. It focuses on the people doing the learning. You'll hear phrases such as empowering the students to avoid triggering discussions and provide safe spaces. Types of curriculums. There's 4 types that we'll address today. There's explicit. Explicit curriculum is the word on the page. It's the book handed to your child. It's the video shown to your child. That feeds the rest of the teaching. Implicit curriculum is the learning that occurs via other means. Examples would be with the teacher's manuals, instruct the teachers to say to the students the activities that center around the reading, the repetition, the ideology behind it, student activities as well, and assessments. Null curriculum is the topics that are not taught. And in this day and age, one would submit that a null curriculum could be the founding documents, history of Marxism, communism, and the positive aspects of U.S. history. Supplemental curriculum are materials outside of the textbook approval process. There's no official approval required for these. They're highly unregulated. Examples would be Brain Pop, Achieve 3000, and the Gale database, as well as materials just in general available on the internet. Wit and Wisdom. So what is it? It is an ELA, English Language Arts curriculum. The publisher is Great Minds. Each grade is divided into 4 modules. In the fall, you get module 1 and 2. The spring brings modules 3 and 4. But what's the definition of curriculum? The lessons and academic content taught in a school. which includes the learning standards the students are expected to meet, the units and lessons that teachers teach, also the assignments and projects given to students, the books, materials, videos, presentations, and readings used in a course, as well as the tests, assessments, and other methods used to evaluate student learning. Now, Moms for Liberty has a couple issues, quite a few many issues with wit and wisdom. In the scope of our research on this curriculum, we found common threads throughout. So it's not just this grade and this book, and the fourth grade in this book, and the third grade in this book. These are threads that run from kindergarten to fifth grade, and they surface repeatedly in various grades. Some surface in all grades, some surface every other grade. But we found concerning and interesting the common threads. First one, suicide ideation. Suicide ideation appears in the first grade, then again in the third grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade. The theme of bad white people first appears in the first grade, again in the second grade and the fifth grade. Extreme emotion is present in all grades, and this harkens back a little to the social emotional learning. Cannibalism, strangely enough, is present in first, third, and fourth grade, and anti-nuclear family or traditional family is seen in the first, fourth, and fifth grade. Continuing, anti-Americanism skips kindergarten but starts in the first grade and goes through all grades. Dark imagery is prevalent in all grades. Graphic death, prevalent in all grades. And what we consider to be age-inappropriate topics, prevalent in all grades. Now, what would we call age-inappropriate topics? In kindergarten, murder. First grade, graphic mating, gender fluidity. Second grade, anti-police, anti-fire department. In third grade, again, graphic death, torture, anti-church. Fourth grade, students are presented with rape, murder, adultery, scalping and skinning, stillbirth. And the fifth grade, excessive gore, excessive violence, alcoholism, promiscuity, and harmful relationships. Keep in mind, these are elementary school children. Let's take a look at Wit and Wisdom's explicit and some of the implicit curriculum. Beginning with kindergarten. Our first introduction to a depressing storyline with lots of dark illustrations is Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears. This is where the first pervasive theme of death and negative emotions begins. The chain of events ends with the tragic death of a baby owl. Her other children told her that the monkey had killed it. All that day and all that night she sat in her tree, so sad, so sad, so sad. The animals feared that the mother owl would never call for the sun to rise again. The book goes on, showing that the animals now live in darkness and anger. There's a dark illustration of the mad monkey attempting to murder the baby owl with a branch. Quote, "Monkey killed one of my owlets. Because of that, I cannot bear to wake the sun." This is dealing with murder, dark imagery, and depression. Page after page in this book has lots of illustrations of angry animals. Kindergartners spend 5 days on this book with this imagery. Moving on to the first grade. Seahorses, the shyest fish in the sea. We found this to be a soft introduction to sex ed. The gender roles are switched. First graders spend 6 days on the seahorse book. The seahorse finds a mate. They twist their tails together and twirl gently around, changing color until they match. Today, Seahorse's mate is full of ripe eggs. The two of them dance until sunset, and then she puts her eggs into his pouch. The seahorses mate every few weeks during the breeding season. Only the male seahorse has a pouch. Only the female seahorse can grow eggs. But this is a pretty graphic depiction of seahorse mating positions in this book. Seahorses are the only male fish to get pregnant like this, growing their young inside their own bodies. It's time for the babies to be born. He works hard all day and through the night, bending, squeezing, and pushing, shooting hundreds of babies out of his pouch. So basically, the dad gives birth here. This is the kid's first introduction to gender roles being switched. The question is, are they ready for that? The lesson also includes a video. It's about a 3-minute video called Pygmy Seahorses, Masters of Camouflage. I watched the video. It's actually pretty fascinating, but the last 10 seconds have the punch. We humans tend to think of who we are as mostly fixed, but in the ocean, identity can be a fluid and mysterious thing. The teacher's manual questions the students about how do the seahorses mate, how do the seahorses give birth, emphasizes that only the male seahorse can get pregnant, that the male seahorse gives birth, that the dad seahorse works hard to give birth, and the main topic is how seahorses have babies. I would submit that there's a lot of other things that you can talk about with regard to seahorses. Continuing in the first grade, Brave Irene, this is Module 3. This is the student's first introduction to suicide ideation in the Wit and Wisdom curriculum. The girl Irene gets lost in a snowstorm, and you can see at the bottom of the page, her teeth chattered. Why not freeze to death, she thought, and let all these troubles end? Why not? She was already buried. The teacher's manual instructs students to think of a scene from the text that showed how Irene was brave. Then they are instructed to stand up and act it out. The scenes that it offers the students are: she leaves her warm, safe house. She walks through a snowstorm and keeps going, though she's hurt. It's dark and she is alone. She fights with the wind. But also, Irene gets buried by the snow and almost dies. So you're asking students to act out the scene of the suicide ideation. Next book is Feelings by Aliki. Although many feelings are discussed, the vast majority of text and illustrations emphasize negative feelings. The little boy is scared about a dragon who eats children. Quote, "The dragon's gigantic mouth opened, thousands of teeth shone in the dark. The smell of eaten children filled the boy's nostrils." Again, first grade. The story on the left talks about Alicia has the most beautiful curly hair of all my friends. Then she envies the curly hair. The girl goes on to say, "I'd like to choke Alicia. I hate Alicia," and snarls. The story on the right, Whiskers is a story about the death of a pet. For 4 nights, this is assigned to them for homework. For 4 nights, they read about the death of a beloved pet. Whiskers died. Oh, poor Whiskers. You had her so long. I'm sad for you. She was old. She was sick. She had to die sometime. My heart is broken. She was silly. She was funny. We'll miss you, Whiskers. Of all the things to have a first grader focus on for 4 nights, the death of a pet is a depressing subject indeed, even for an adult. This page, an outburst in many words. The boy is mad. He's yelling at a child who used his crayons without asking. This is from the teacher's manual. It instructs the students, specifically directs the kids to focus on the negative emotions. At the top of the page, highlighted, you'll see it says, explain that students will focus on one feeling, either furious or sad, even though there are more feelings represented in the book. So literally, the teacher's manual restricts students to discussing furious or sad. It's a social emotional learning. For the furious part, on page 5, there's a picture of a girl who could be furious. She tries to kick the boy and is yelling at him. Page 9, a lot of the kids look really mad at John. Tom also looks really mad that John knocked down his blocks. He looks like he is shouting at John. Page 11, Kate looks really furious. She has a mad face and is growling and says, "I hate Alicia," in all caps. On pages 16 to 17, the boy is yelling at another boy, and his face looks really furious. The words coming out of his mouth are in all caps. And he says that gets him mad when someone takes his things. Page 18, the little boy looks furious. His eyebrows are pointing down, and he is yelling no. On page 31, there's a picture of a boy who is furious. The text says furious, and he looks very mad. Why must we focus on furious? Here's the teacher's manual on sad. On page 5, the boy looks like he feels sad after the girl yells at him. Page 15, the girl and boy look sad. The girl's pet whiskers died and she is crying. Page 24, I see a little kid crying. Page 26, Bob looks sad about giving a sundial to Alfred for his birthday. He is frowning. On page 31, there's a picture of a boy who is sad. He has tears coming from his face. Again, sadness and anger. Page 12, as part of the extension, page 12, the boy looks sad that he threw the airplane, and another way to describe that feeling is ashamed or embarrassed. It goes into detail. Ashamed means feeling bad about yourself, usually because you did something wrong, and embarrassed means experiencing feelings of shame or unease. Now, we'll come back to this shame inflicted on a child later on in this presentation. On page 14, another way to describe the girl besides sad is nervous. Another one is sick and embarrassed. So talking about shame, you sent your first grader to school and they're learning about anger, sadness, and shame. A summary of the teacher's manual. There are 32 pages in this book, and 22 of those pages have negative emotions on them. The teacher's manual is 506 pages, and feelings are mentioned 639 times. Mentions of mad and angry more than double happy, almost double sad. Sad is the runner-up with 79 mentions, followed by scared, heartbroken, and miserable. Happy is only mentioned 41 times, and joy is the loser at only 4 times. This is The Rough-Faced Girl. It's a Cinderella story for first graders. From the second picture, quote, when the burning branches popped, the sparks fell on her. In time, her hands became burnt and scarred. Her arms, too, became rough and scarred. Even her face was marked by the fire, and her beautiful long black hair hung ragged and charred. Now, the imagery is angry and dark and emotional. Later on in the book, she meets the invisible man that she will marry. And the last picture is her washing off the scars and her hair regrowing. But some parents would take issue on how much this picture shows of the female body. Moving on to second grade, Johnny Appleseed. Usually a great story. But about 3/4 of the way into the book, there's the angry white people, the mean white people that are chasing the Indians from their homes. Shows the conflict between the white settlers and the Native Americans. Emphasizes it, rather. In the teacher's manual on page 257, wonder about the relationships. Why do the pioneers chase Indians from their homes? This reinforces it over and over again. They read different versions of Johnny Appleseed's story. Again, there are many happier versions of Johnny Appleseed, but why does Wit and Wisdom want to focus on the sad and depressing ones? And on the right, you can see a child's impression of what they learned about Johnny Appleseed. Johnny's mother and little brother die. His dad remarries another woman. Then he left the house because he has too many brothers and sisters. Then he met some animals and Indians. He planted seed everywhere. When Johnny got ill, he died. The buffalo are back. This book paints white settlers, or emphasizes how white settlers forced Indians from their lands and killed most of the buffalo herds to force them onto reservations. The U.S. government is presented as an evil force, breaking treaties, forcing Indians from the lands, and killing buffalo. Again, these are young, impressionable children. To teach them about the evil U.S. government, maybe not the best idea. Quote, "But it was settlers from the east and the American government that killed almost all of the buffalo herds. They forced many Indians to go to reservations and sold the land to settlers. The government broke its treaties with the Indians. Soldiers and settlers were encouraged to shoot every buffalo they saw or drive whole herds over the cliffs. Most of the last wild buffalo went down in dust and gunfire, and there was a death wind on the prairie." This is an activity presented in the teacher's manual for this book. Children are prompted to sort cards of people and events into good and bad categories. And which category do you think the white settlers go into? Furthermore, President Roosevelt and the government. So at a very early age, you're reinforcing ideas with young, impressionable children that white people and the government are bad. And you're doing it again and again. The end result is complete with this child. Notice and wonder. They notice that the government was very, very mean to Indians. Wonder, why was the government so mean to Indians? Another book in the second grade is the book gives warnings about the challenging reading level and what these teacher can do to help the student get through it. It suggests heavy scaffolds are needed to analyze the text. I would submit that it's another example of the lexiles being too high. Wit and Wisdom is touted as raising the lexiles of the students, but if you're presenting books that are unreadable by the children, then perhaps you've missed the mark. Moving on in the second grade, separate is never equal. This book talks about the segregation in California between the white schools and the Mexican schools, but it makes a lot of statements about Mexicans and Mexican children. Quote, "They have generally dirty hands, face, neck, and ears. Mexican schools are inferior to whites in personal hygiene and their scholastic ability. In what other respects are they inferior? In their economic outlook, in their clothing, in their ability to take part in the activities of the school? White students are superior to Mexicans." Of course, these are characters saying this, but does the book ever take the time at the end to correct these statements? And the troubling thing is, no, it doesn't. The imagery of this book, it shows Mexican children sitting in the dirt surrounded by flies at a dilapidated schoolhouse, surrounded by an electric fence with cows on the other side. And just to make it complete, there's a cow patty. More imagery from this book. A sign that says "No dogs or Mexicans allowed," with the Mexican children appearing to be sad on the other side of a cage-looking fence. Moving on to Martin Luther King. Now, the imagery in this book, of course we should teach Dr. King. Of course we should teach about his dream. But do we need to focus on firefighters blasting children with a fire hose so strongly that it's tearing their clothes off and bruising their bodies? What is a second grader going to remember from this book but that? Again, this is an ugly part of our history. Yes, it is. Should it be taught? Yes, it should be taught, but with care and at an age-appropriate level. Next book, Ruby Bridges Goes to School by Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges is later quoted as saying, "I always say to people it would be really, really hard to explain to a 6-year-old child what I was about to encounter going to school that day. I've heard the argument quite a few times that this book is about a 6-year-old. Why can't we teach it to 6-year-olds? Well, Ruby herself acknowledges the challenges with that. More imagery. The kids are also presented with the story of Ruby Bridges. But the themes in this book are clear. Angry white people, black children in a white school, They did not want black children in a white school. Some wanted to hurt her. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. Men and women shouted at her. 3rd grade. Now there's a marine life module of the 3rd grade, and it has a book about sharks in it. Of course, what kid doesn't want to learn about sharks? There's many fascinating facts about sharks. But let's examine the parts of sharks that they present. Graphic illustrations of a shark eating a diver. It has blood coming out of his torso. More graphic illustrations. And personally, I'm not ready to let my kids watch Jaws. I personally don't enjoy watching Jaws, but this imagery is quite strong for a little one. And if you can't see it, the shark is eating the guy's leg, and they're trying to pull him out of the shark's mouth. And then this part of the story, a shark attack that took place at a very unexpected place, a creek. A 12-year-old boy was swimming, screamed, disappeared beneath the water. A man jumped in to drag, quote, Lester's lifeless body from the water. Suddenly the man felt something bump his right leg. When he reached down, he realized part of his leg had been ripped away. They had been attacked by a shark. Both died. Continuing in the 3rd grade, this is where suicide ideation surfaces again. Amos and Boris, quote, he began to wonder what it would be like to drown. Would it take very long? Would it feel just awful? Would his soul go to heaven? Would other mice be there? Back to the extreme emotions. Hitting the water hurt, crazy with rage. Amos screamed and punched at Boris. And then on the next page, or a few pages later, just as he was prepping to die. Why do we need a book about crazy with rage and prepping to die and wanting to die or wondering about dying? Coming to America. Of course, sadly, new arrivals are often poorly treated by other Americans just because they look or act differently. I think this country has risen above that and deserves the credit. Again, more imagery of a child being taken away from a parent. Instead of focusing on the incredible melting pot that is America. Now, let's be clear, the immigrants that came to this country endured hardships, but benefited with incredible opportunities and built this country to be the great country that it is. But why should we focus on nothing but the negative aspects? 3rd grade presents Starry Messenger. All of us, personally, I would be thrilled to have my child learn about Galileo. But you'll find the Starry Messenger focuses not even so much on Galileo, but on creating doubt about the church. His fame grew, but now the church began to worry. Galileo had become too popular. By upholding the idea that the earth was not the center of the universe, he had gone against the Bible and everything the ancient philosophers had taught. He had gone against the church. Galileo was ordered to stop believing what he could see with his own 2 eyes. He was summoned to appear before the highest ruler of the land, the Pope. Galileo was afraid. He knew that people had suffered terrible torture and punishment for not following tradition. It could happen to him. Now, do we need to explain to 3rd graders what torture is? And furthermore, please look at the imagery on this page. On either side, you see bodies hanging from the wall, as well as heads, some of them not even human. On the back of the wall are flames, and then surrounding Galileo in the middle is a very long serpent. So not only have we talked about suffering at the hands of the church and torture, but the imagery in this book is disturbing to say the least. Galileo was condemned to spend the rest of his life locked in his house under guard, but he still had stars on his mind. Again, the church doing this to him. He was tried in the Pope's court, and everyone could see that the stars had left his eyes. So pause and examine that this is a depiction of the church. All the angry red men is the church condemning him. He stands in the center, sad, but not only that, look at the imagery that surrounds him in the center. You see a grim reaper, some demonic or pagan type symbols. The teacher's manual instructs children to think critically about Christian traditions. What tradition did people just follow during the time of Galileo? Most people, quote, just follow the tradition that the earth was the center of the universe. Why did people, again, quote, just follow tradition during the time of Galileo? People just followed tradition because people had believed the same thing for hundreds of years. People just followed tradition because the church supported it. How does the church's reaction to Galileo's challenge to tradition build your knowledge of the role of tradition during the time of Galileo? The church was worried because Galileo challenged its traditions, so they punished him harshly. The church's reaction shows that tradition was very important. So in the teacher's manuals, across 2 pages, you see anti-church and anti-tradition, and emphasizing that the church is fallible. Teacher's manual, page 90. Galileo being called to see the leader of the church, Galileo was worried that he would be tortured because of his belief, because the church found him guilty of heresy. Now, I'm not saying that the church is infallible. I'm not even making a statement about the church. But what if the parents that have brought their kids up in Sunday school every Sunday, going to church every Sunday, and they receive 20 lessons in the 3rd grade that are distinctly anti-church? I'd like to point out a recent quote in the Tennessean. One of our board members believes parents are just as important as educators, just as important of educators as teachers on topics like family history, religion, values, personal experiences, and reviews. This is to suggest that parents are co-parenting with Williamson County Schools on topics such as religion and values. If the child doesn't understand or doesn't agree with the content, that's when it's the home. That's where parents say, listen, we don't agree with it in this family, and this is why, but in a positive way. I would submit you could bring your child up all the way through the 3rd grade, going to church and reading the Bible, but then they send their child to the 3rd grade Starry Messenger module, and they receive 20 lessons on how the church is bad, and the parent may not even know that. And now the parent has to undo the values and the religious teaching at home. That sounds backwards. Moving on to the 4th grade, George versus George. There's not many books, especially children's books, where you see an angry George Washington on the cover. It talks about the Declaration of Independence, but in the main body of the text, it says, writing a document that claimed the right of all people to choose their own government. In the main body of the text, what about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a null curriculum. It's mentioned in the illustration in the bottom, but not in its entirety. The full teaching or the full wording of the Declaration of Independence should be taught in a reading about the Declaration of Independence. But here we have the dark imagery or the dark subject matter that comes in at the bottom. When it captures our citizens at sea, they must either fight against their own countrymen or kill themselves. On the left side, each side told a different tale about Lexington and Concord. Rebel newspapers reported that bloodthirsty redcoats burned houses, drove naked women into the streets, and butchered old men and infants. The king was told that rebel savages broke the rules of war by ambushing his army. Then they scalped fallen British infantry and cut off their ears. Next page. Meanwhile, the redcoats were trying to terrorize rebel supporters. They looted or seized people's houses, raped and murdered innocent civilians, set fire to crops and timberland. British troops died like flies. Indians, fighting alongside the British, burned 1,000 homes, tortured and killed whole families, and scalped the dead. Some Indians honored their bravest victims by eating them. They collected, or for revenge, rebels troops sent by George Washington destroyed 41 Native American villages, many of which were peaceful, and burned all their crops and orchards. They collected scalps and showed off pairs of leggings from the skin of dead Indians. To this day, the Iroquois people called George Washington Town Destroyer. And here's a close-up of the imagery on that page. So in the book about George Washington, the students have been exposed to rape, murder, scalping, and skinning. Moving on to Hatchet by Gary Paulson. These are dark topics. It covers infidelity. His mother, sitting in the station wagon with the man, she had leaned across and kissed the man with the short blonde hair, and it was not a friendly peck, but a kiss. She put her mouth against the mouth of the blonde man who was not his father and kissed mouth to mouth. Saw this thing that his mother did with the blonde man, saw the kiss that became the secret that his father still did not know about. Moving on to suicide. To where he wanted to die, he had settled into the gray funk deeper and deeper, until finally in the dark he had gone up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. But the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do. And he had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end. So again, suicide ideation makes its appearance in the 4th grade, and infidelity underscores the anti-nuclear family narrative. Moving on to mythology. Now check out the imagery on this page. The Furies were 3 goddesses of vengeance wearing long black robes. Serpents twined through their long white hair and coiled around their arms. Blood dripped from their black eyes. On the next page, it talks about the Furies going after the murderers. As soon as they caught the scent of the murderers, they gave chase. The men, seeing the dark flapping shapes approaching, ran in terror, but they could not escape. The Furies lashed their whips till the murderers bled. They tore snakes out from their hair and hurled them at the killers' backs. Down the snakes slid, winding, twisting, but never biting. Instead, they exhaled poisonous fumes that affected the men's minds, and they began to rave. Refusing to give any rest, the Furies chased and tormented the murderers until at last they went mad. Such was the punishment of the Furies. But then it goes on to say, for who among us has never done anything wrong? Perhaps the Furies would come after you. This is violent, graphic imagery. And as an adult, I find it to be violent and graphic imagery, but I can handle it. Is this appropriate for an elementary school child? In this page, Tantalus had his own son Pelops cooked and served as a meal. Cannibalism again. Dark imagery. There's an angel and a demon. I would submit that the demon is a pretty disturbing, haunting image, as well as children acting out death and the goddess coming out of the water. Skip one. Okay, pushing up the sky is a cannibal monster again. And then in another book, Understanding Greek Myths, it says, it might seem unusual to us, but many myths include stories of people, mainly children, who were sliced, cooked, and eaten. Again, elementary school children. Walk 2 Moons, the teacher's manual on page 91, quote, "This sophisticated cognitive work builds a foundation for critical thinking, including concepts related to social justice." The teacher's manual goes on to give 3 different warnings about emotionally mature material. Emotionally mature material throughout, including stillborn birth, the disappearance of 2 mothers, one of whom dies, and the death of a grandmother. Talks about intense chapters. Says, give your students a warning about the emotional content. This text contains much sadness and loss. Emotions will be strong. I know Hatchet has been read in, Walk Two Moons. I would submit that, can we find a text that does not require warnings, multiple warnings for emotional content? And from this book, I heard my mother calling. Her voice was distant and faint. Coming, I thought, from near the barn. I answered, but my voice was caught in my chest. Moving forward, the baby came that night. I heard my father telephoning the doctor. She won't make it, he said. It's happening now, right now. She saw me standing there and said, you shouldn't watch. I don't think I'm very good at this. My mother screamed. Just once, one long, mournful wail, and then it was quiet. When the doctor carried the baby out of the room, I asked to see it. It had a pale bluish tinge, and there were marks on its neck where the umbilical cord had strangled it. It might have been dead for hours, the doctor said. Was it a boy or a girl, I asked. The doctor whispered, a girl. I asked if I could touch her. She was still a little warm from being inside my mother. I thought maybe if I held her, I could wake her up. He said to me, it wasn't your fault, Sal. It wasn't because she carried you. You mustn't think that. The baby, she said, it didn't make it, he said. I'll hold the baby, she said. It didn't make it, he repeated. It can't be dead. It was alive just a minute ago. I slept beside her until I heard her calling my father. When he turned on the light, I saw the blood spread out all across the bed. It had soaked the sheets and the blankets. It had soaked into the white plaster of my cast. My mother had 2 operations in the next 2 days. She wouldn't stop bleeding. Later, my mother said they took out all my equipment. She would not have any more babies. Continuing, in my book was a picture of a tree. I drew a round head with curly hair, put a rope around the neck, and attached it to the tree. 5th grade. Now this is the oral, listen to the oral telling of a coyote and monster story, so there's no associated text that goes with it, but it instructs the students to try and picture the characters and events in their minds as they listen. Quote, discovering that the monster had eaten all of the people, Coyote tricked the creature into eating him. Once inside, he first cut off the monster's heart and then cut up its body. When he was done, Coyote washed his bloody hands and sprinkled the wash water across the valleys. Module 1 in the 5th grade, Cultures in Conflict, from the book Thunder Rolling in the Mountains, repeated themes of violence. Setting fire to their tent, shoot a soldier. I shot him to kill us. Bullet went in the back of his shoulder and came out through his chest. So many bullets. Soldiers shot at their heads and killed all. We will kill them all. Killed all of his soldiers. Kill you, kill them, murdered. Kill the old man, took his knife. He cut the monster's heart from its body. The antelope fell dead. Violence continued. Last night I saw myself killed. I will kill some soldiers. We are all going to die. He smashed his rifle butt into her face, killed another white man. A whip that had an iron tip, wiping the blood from his knife. I felt a noose slip around my neck. It drew tight and the world went black. A bullet struck him in the head. The next bullet struck her in the chest. She got the gun from him and took careful aim and shot him in the face. Swiftly, she grabbed my ear and thrust the needle through it. I screamed with pain. The bullet would strike him squarely in the back. Bodies strewn across the ground. I saw the dead people. Same book. Common quotes about the white man. He hated the whites, murdered by a white man. Hated the whites. They were all enemies. Then whites decided something. He was a wicked man and would kill me if he could. Killed white men. White generals are men with 2 faces and 2 tongues. Driven off by the whites. White scavengers will steal their locusts and they'll devour us. Excessive gore. And this is from the book A River Between Us. And I know there's been discussion of pulling A River Between Us from the 5th grade curriculum, but I'm going to go ahead and brief it because it was there. and this is recommended by Wit and Wisdom. Gore, tied hand and foot, burned by the sun, tongue lolled out of his mouth, around his neck a sign. Bodies boiled alive would wash ashore for days, blood soaked, stumps of legs, cries of the town. Saw a boy who'd been shot full in the face, amputated, the blood-slick years of war. Swollen carcasses of dogs, even a dead horse half in a cut of water red with its blood. A left arm was gone, blood-soaked bandages, gray corpse faces eaten away by the fish. The bridal veil snagged in the bride's skeleton shoulder. She saw their ghosts, dying all around him and lost their limbs. The river between us, lots of mentions of drunkenness. He's drunk. All men are drunkards. The other were half drunk, smoking their El Sol cigars and drinking from small silver cups. Some of them staggering drunk, drunk reeling drunk, and fighting drunk. I had to get him drunk to take his arm. Continuing the river between us, topics of promiscuity and relationships. The brazen little hussy. What men do best is walk away from women. And that painted up little floozy. I've held on to my husband, unlike some I can name. She came in handy. She is meant for men. Restless small town men can get. Pressed her feather fan against her bosom and cast great fringed eyes up at him. Bloomed on her breast. She had a powerful effect on the male sex. Also part of Wit and Wisdom is the cause from the Civil War series. I understand that some teachers in Williamson County are given the option to omit some of the footage from this video. But again, this is in the Wit and Wisdom curriculum. I would submit that I, as an adult, have a hard time seeing these images, let alone a fifth grader. Bodies strewn about and dead soldiers, dead animals. This is Module 4, Breaking Barriers. If you read the highlighted text, it sounds to me a lot like Catcher in the Rye. It reads a lot that way, and then I wonder, or I remember, when did I read Catcher in the Rye? It was high school. And again, this is a fifth grade book. So now we've gone over K through fifth grade, the explicit and some of the teacher's manuals, the explicit curriculum and some teacher's manuals. Now we'll take a deeper look into one specific module and the teacher's manuals that cover 9 weeks of learning. This is second grade, Module 3, titled Civil Rights Heroes. It was taught January 4th through March 13th of this year, 9 weeks. 9 weeks are spent focusing on injustice. The teacher's manual mentions injustice 314 times in a 478-page manual. The students are told to develop a nonverbal sign for injustice and that they should make that signal throughout the module as they hear examples of injustice. The lesson on prefixes selects injustice, unequal, inequality, unfair. The lesson on suffixes teaches segregation. The vocabulary lesson includes protest, refuse, and marching. Day 5 asks the kids what would make a good protest song. Now, in terms of basic grammar, prefixes, suffixes, and vocabulary, could we not have found some words that weren't quite so dark and controversial and loaded? Day 1 of the Civil Rights Heroes module, point out the word injustice. Explain that unfair and injustice mean the same thing. Injustice is a stronger word. Explain how real people respond to injustice. Explore the word injustice. Reread, how can people respond to injustice? Echo read, what injustices did people face before the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Point to the word injustice. Remind the class about the meaning of this word injustice. And it goes on and on. Remind the class of the meaning of the word injustice again. What does injustice mean? What do you remember about injustice? What do you remember about how people can respond to injustice? What is an example of injustice? Record the word, add their example, investigate the injustices people faced, and how they respond to injustice. Day 12, what might a just world be? Now, this is a loaded concept here because you're implying that the country in which we live in is not a just world. Day 32, how can children respond to injustice? So you're teaching a second grader what they can do to respond to injustice. If you look at the news today, that would be marching and protests and all the other sort of thing. But again, you're embedding this in the mind of a second grader. What happens if we don't respond to injustices? What will you do to make the world a more fair or just place? And it emphasizes that the struggle for equal rights continues to this day. On day 5, they hand out the lyrics to Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. But I'd like to remind you that this is an English language arts curriculum. And why are we teaching improper grammar and improper English? Day 24. Children at the Mexican school are inferior to whites in personal hygiene and in their scholastic ability. Mexican children are inferior in their economic outlook and their clothing and in their ability to take part in the activities of the school. White students are superior to Mexicans. It's important to note these statements are not denounced as false in the pages that follow. Days 27 and 28, these statements are read again and again. Students are asked to write a narrative from the point of view of Sylvia as she listens to these words. And not only that, they have to do that twice. Okay, it talks about how separate is not equal. It's actually above the lexile reading level of second graders, and it instructs the teacher to read aloud the next 2 lessons because of the complexity of the text. So therefore, they want the teacher to emphasize the rich illustrations of the book. There's a heavy emphasis on the imagery of separate is never equal. Quote, the class will first notice and wonder only about the illustrations in the text. Explain that you will move through the book slowly, allowing each child to look at the pictures. Keep students engaged by providing 2 sticky notes each to jot down ideas about their observations and their questions. But again and again, look at the pictures, wonder about the pictures, focus on the pictures. This is eliciting an emotional response. Day 24 and 25. Day 24, before the text is read aloud, the teacher's manual sets aside time for students to make long observations of these highly inflammatory illustrations that are demeaning to Mexicans. The Mexican children are portrayed like animals behind bars, as inferior as dogs or cows, and white people are portrayed as evil, superior oppressors. Day 25, students are asked again, what is something that you noticed and wondered about the illustrations? Day 24, a young white boy yelled, go back to the Mexican school. Day 19, I see many white people yelling at us. On day 19, they have narrative expansion. But how do they expand the narrative? They expand it with, I see many white people yelling at us. Why are they being so mean? I want to cry. Why did the Mendez family fight for desegregation? The answer, they fought so that white people would stop thinking they were better than Mexican people. Again, this is not the explicit curriculum. This is the implicit curriculum taught to them through the teacher's manual day after day after day. Day 27. Another response cards exercise. Sylvia doesn't want to go to that school that has white kids because the white kids are mean. Day 31. This is an assessment. The historical photographs show racial violence. They focus on racial violence. And the assessment talks about under blasting fire hoses we're acting non-violently, and goes to show that the firemen were acting violently. They met hate every day, including from the all-white police force. They expected unfair arrests, beatings, or worse from police. To the black community, one man stood for hate more than any other person in Birmingham. Eugene Bull Connor was the commissioner of public safety. This meant that he led the police and fire departments. So there it is, your anti-police, anti-fire department narrative in the second grade. Back to day one, they asked the students to focus on these images. They asked the questions, what do you notice about the images? They should notice and wonder about the images. Pause to give students extra time to notice the details of these photographs. Furthermore, the text, in case the students missed it in the story of Ruby Bridges, or rather Ruby Bridges Goes to School, the teacher's manual actually points out and teaches the N-word. They say that the use of the N-word was common and used today as a hateful slur. Discuss how words can be used to attack and disrespect people. Students may or may not notice this word. It says, post the following sentence. A mob stood outside the school yelling at Ruby. Tell students that a big crowd of people that wants to be violent is called a mob. Brainstorm adjectives as a class that could describe the mob. And in case the students missed the point, the teacher has suggested words: angry, scary, mean, loud. And again, you're telling the students to focus on a picture of white people using the words angry, scary, mean, and loud. That's day 14. Day 15, a lesson on adjectives and adverbs. To describe the white people, again, the teachers are instructed to use rudely and vicious. Again, the crowd seemed ready to kill her. Angry white people gathered outside the elementary school. The people carried signs and said they didn't want black children in a white school. Some wanted to hurt her. Day 16, write a narrative from the point of view of Ruby Bridges. So to inflict the psychological distress of Ruby Bridges' own experience onto the students, the second graders are tasked with writing a narrative from her point of view. Now, asking 7-year-olds to go through this writing exercise is psychologically abusive. And if that wasn't enough discomfort, they must role play one page of her experience. Now, this is the last page of the story. It doesn't have an ending of unity and integration. She's praying to God, asking them to forgive the white people for their ignorance. But again, it mentions nothing of the Civil Rights Act. It mentions nothing of the progress the country has made since then. Day 30. Students are tasked with writing another narrative. They can pick from Ruby Bridges or Sylvia Mendez during the scenes when they both felt mistreatment by white people, thereby reliving the emotional trauma of each experience. So as you can see, this is 9 weeks of day after day after day of evil white people, the failings of our country, and with no nod towards redemption, with no nod towards progress, with no nod towards how far we've come, how we as a nation strive to embrace the Martin Luther King's ideal of judging someone on the content of their character versus the color of their skin. This only focuses on the negative, only focuses on the ugly parts. And if you pound that into a second grade child for 9 weeks, then the results are predictable. One could ask, would grade 2 module 3 violate the anti-CRT law? The law has multiple tenets. I'll read 4 of them that could be a candidate. Ultimately, it'll be the Department of Education, the commissioner, or maybe a judge that decides. But tenet 1, one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Number 6, an individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or another form of psychological distress solely because of the individual's race or sex. Number 8, this state or the United States is fundamentally or irredeemably racist or sexist. And number 10, promoting division between or resentment of a race, sex, religion, creed, political affiliation, or social class or class of people. I would submit those for your analysis in light of what we just covered in Grade 2, Module 3. So, what could this do to a child? Could it create shame in a child? What happens when you tell a child, if they're white, that they're inherently evil? And if they're black, that they're inherently oppressed? I'd like to play this clip from our May event, CRT 101, in which Dr. Gary Thompson, a clinical psychologist, clinical and forensic psychologist, addressed our gathering about shame.
Bit about shame. Imagine being aged 11 and either directly or it's implied, hey, your mom, your dad, they're systemically broken. Your great-grandma and great-grandpa or great-great-grandpa, they were slave owners. And because of them, I can't get a job. And as someone said in the back, you're bad. That's shaming. There are psychological underpinnings for the impacts of shame. I'm going to read. This is from the Journal of Anxiety Disorder, Shame and Guilt Proneness, Relationship with Anxiety Disorders in a Clinical Sample. Here's a snapshot from that. Internal shame seems especially relevant to both social anxiety disorder and generalized anxiety disorder symptoms. Remember that. Social anxiety disorder and generalized depression. From the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences, a snapshot from there. Their main point: how individuals cope with feelings of shame is an important predictive factor for depressive symptoms. And the final article here that I got from that conservative school, Harvard School Public of Health. Their snapshot. Both shame proneness and guilt proneness were significantly related to higher levels of both PTSD symptoms and somatization symptoms, whereas only shame proneness was significantly related to higher levels of psychological symptoms. Shame brings on anxiety, which can bring on major depressive disorders, and those are the foundational basis for suicidal ideations. Our town in Utah, we have the 4th highest suicide rate between the ages of 11 and 17, and that is based upon anxiety and depression. As I talked about the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm, no matter what your school board does, you need to make sure that it does nothing to increase a child's anxiety or their level of depression. And shame is the number one and a very powerful way to bring on anxiety and depression, which just is another way of saying that's a very powerful way that you can be pushing your kids to suicide.
In Williamson County schools, you have at least one second grader, 2 first graders, and a 4th grader that are all struggling with shame, that are all ashamed of their skin color, asking why people hate them, identifying other historical figures by skin color alone, asking if they would be killed in that time, some asking if their family should be killed because of their skin color. These This is what happens when you plant these seeds in a young mind. This mind is defenseless. They have no historical context for these teachings. They take it to heart because these are young children who take everything to heart, and better care should be used in presenting these topics. So, how did Wit and Wisdom get into Williamson County schools? This was the approved ELA adoption list published by the state. And people have talked about the new ELA standards. So 31 July of 2018, the Tennessee Department of Ed adopts new ELA standards. They have to notify the various publishers by December 31st of that year of the new standards. The following year, on November 16th, the ELA adoption list was published. And on the 6th of December, they followed up and added Wit and Wisdom grades 3 through 8. On the December 9th, the Williamson County schools with that list published textbook review dates in the In Focus. There were 3 dates in January, 2 in February. There were 5 available options for Williamson County schools in December of 2019. And that's not including Wit and Wisdom. There was Amplify CKLA, there was Advanced by Benchmark, Learn Zillion, Expeditionary Learning, McGraw-Hill Wonders, that's what we had previous, and Open Up EL Learning. In this list, Wit and Wisdom was not a contender. Let me say again, in December of 2019, Wit and Wisdom was not a contender because it was only grades 3 through 8. And Williamson County Schools was looking through an all-inclusive K through 5. So in late December 2019 or January 2020, the Tennessee DOE Wit and Wisdom expanded to K through 8. But here's the thing. Wit and Wisdom never passed Tennessee standards. Let me say that again. Wit and Wisdom never passed a single state review. A lot of attention has been paid to the new ELA standards, and that because of these new ELA standards that suddenly McGraw-Hill Wonders was not as attractive as Wit and Wisdom. But Wit and Wisdom is the one that failed the new standards twice. Wit and Wisdom, so the top 3 K through 5 ELA curriculums that were promoted by the Department of Ed was Great Minds Wit and Wisdom, Amplify CKLA, and Open Up Resources EL Education. These curriculums were piloted in 17 lifted districts, and they were heavily promoted by Tennessee SCORE, the State Collaboration on Reforming Education. So if you look at the document on the left, you see the results of the main review. Note, first 3 programs were heavily promoted by Tennessee DOE and were piloted in lift districts. Amplify, Wit and Wisdom, and EL Education all failed miserably. Then there was re-review. The Tennessee Department of Ed fired the original reviewers and hired new reviewers. And of the top 3, suddenly, actually 2 of 3 fail again. Wit and Wisdom being one of them. And 33 waivers were granted for K through 2, along with the TDOE promise to create free supplemental material. Okay, back to, okay. So, due to the new ELA standards, again, I want to emphasize, they said that McGraw-Hill Wonders was suddenly less attractive than Wit and Wisdom. But this is the rubric for the kindergarten review of McGraw-Hill Wonders. And notice that it passed the first review. This is one of 20 sheets of their scoring rubric associated with the Wonders kindergarten curriculum. In fact, here's K through 5 of the Wonders curriculum. All of them passed the first review. Wit and Wisdom failed the first and second reviews. You can see the first red box, 5 reviewers failed it in section 4, and it got an overall fail. Then there's the re-review. It failed again, failed at the bottom. And this is for kindergarten. Now compare the scoring rubrics. This is 1 of 1 sheets versus McGraw-Hill's 20 sheets. Here's wit and wisdom first grade. It failed the first review and then failed the second review. But also notice that the first review had 5 reviewers and the second review only 2. Second grade, same thing. Third grade, this is where it changes a little bit because it failed the first review, and then the failing grade in the second was overridden by the Tennessee DOE and changed to a pass. And they did this because, if you read the verbiage at the bottom, that, well, wit and wisdom passed sections 1, 2, and 3, and since there's a little bit of overlap with section 2 and 4, then we're going to give you a pass. Same with 4th grade, and same with 5th grade. Now, as a contrast, remember that the top 3 curriculums pushed by the Department of Ed, CKLA did get a second round pass, and this is what it looks like. A fail on the initial review, and then a pass, but no overriding of failures needed. So how did this happen? Well, let's look at the timeline. In June 1st of 2019, the first deadline for newly appointed ELA textbook reviewers came in on June 1st of 2019. They submitted their results for their first test review, which would prove their ability to follow the rubric and properly score a textbook. The commissioner would have received her first warning on June 1st that the instructional materials being piloted by all of the LIFT districts sponsored by SCORE were being failed by reviewers and were in danger of not making the approved textbook list. Just 2 days later, on June 3rd of 2019, the department quickly notified publishers of an update to the scoring protocol, or the rubric, to make it harder to fail a textbook. Previously, if majority of reviewers of a textbook, 3 out of 5, failed any section of the book, then the entire book failed. But now, 3 out of 5 had to agree to fail the same section of that book before it could be failed. June 11th, the update to the scoring protocol was added to the textbook commission meeting agenda and was unanimously adopted. Despite all of that, on July 2nd, the final results of the first round of actual textbook reviews were made known to the commissioner and to the publishers. All 3 of the programs used in SCORE's pilot districts significantly failed the main review. Amplify failed all grades 1 through 8 with the exception of grade 4. Great Minds, Wit and Wisdom failed all grades with the exception of grade 7. And Open Up failed all grades 1 through 5. In August, the textbook review process was halted indefinitely. The DOE hired Johns Hopkins for a high-level review of their processes. They fired all the current reviewers, and they recruited new reviewers through a webinar. And they were to perform, quote, re-reviews of failing textbooks. They trained the new reviewers using ELA experts to show how to review and score using the rubric. Now, the new round of reviews, normally a textbook review would be conducted off-site, independent of the Department of Ed, but the new reviews were conducted under the watchful eye of department officials while assembled together. However, the DOE claims that reviewers maintained their independence while reviewing together under the department's guidance. If it doesn't smell right, it's probably not right. Shortly thereafter, the department reported that previously failed CKLA, Amplify, and Learnzillion guidebooks had passed 100% under the new reviews. For certain upper grades of Wit and Wisdom that failed again on second review, the department overruled the results and declared them approved. That was October. October 1st, the waiver application window opens. Later in October, CKLA and Learnzillion pass 100%. Wit and Wisdom and Open Up fail again. The DOE overrules and declares they're approved. The DOE changes waiver process for materials already in use, meaning those SCORE and LIFT districts that were already using failed materials under a pilot program could continue doing so. In all, 70 waivers were ultimately granted by the Department of Ed so that districts could use failed materials, 33 of which were for Wit and Wisdom. November 16th, as previously covered, the ELA adoption list was published. December 6th, Wit and Wisdom was added to that list. And in December 30th, I don't know if it's the first county, but Sumner County submits a waiver for Wit and Wisdom. Here's the 33 counties waived for Wit and Wisdom. Throughout 2020, the Tennessee DOE promised districts between $16 to $18 per student for using the textbooks on the state's approved list or those for which a waiver had been granted. So there's been a lot of talk of no money involved in the decision to adopt Wit and Wisdom, but there it is right there. It's not a lot of money, but it's money. Furthermore, the Tennessee DOE took an unprecedented step and became its own publisher, creating and providing the free supplemental material to prop up Wit and Wisdom in the K through 2nd grade. The bottom line is that between 2019 and 2020, the Tennessee Department of Ed materially altered, without penalty, the approved adoption process to engineer approvals for repeatedly failed materials. So how did repeatedly failed materials make its way into Williamson County? November 18th of 2019, the textbook adoption committee members were set and submitted to the board for approval, comprised of 28 teachers and 26 parents. On December 9th, the county publishes the public textbook review days and the impact. There were 3 days in January, 2 in February. Between late December, early January, the book samples were delivered for CKLA, EL, and Wonders. 6 copies per district, 5 copies to the review sites, and 1 to the PD warehouse. Again, none of those included the Wit and Wisdom texts. January 15th, 21st, and 30th were the public review dates. Again, Wit and Wisdom was not present at the public review dates. And that brings us to February of 2020. So February 3rd and 6th, those are the scheduled public review dates. On February 8th, it became known that the Tennessee Department of Ed would offer a free supplemental curriculum if Wit and Wisdom was adopted. Shortly thereafter, on February 13th, Williamson County Schools applies for the waiver. On February 17th, there's a teacher PD day. Workbooks, I'm told that workbooks and teachers' manuals were reviewed, but the actual books for Wit and Wisdom were not present. On February 18th, Williamson County adds an additional public review date. The teachers start voting. February 21st, the waiver is approved by the state for the district to use Wit and Wisdom. And that was a Friday. So the waiver is approved on a Friday. You have 2 business days until the additional public review date. And then 2 more business days until March 2nd, when the textbook review committee votes to recommend Wit and Wisdom for adoption. So the bottom line is you've had a 3-month process for the selection and review of materials. You've had 5 days of public review, but only a total of 6, but only one of the 6 days included Wit and Wisdom, and Wit and Wisdom waiver was granted on February 21st in literally the last week of this process. So why? Of course, after March 2nd, COVID-19 kicks off, and on March 30th, the board follows the recommendation of the Textbook Review Committee and votes 12-0 to adopt Wit and Wisdom. Moving forward into June, it became made aware when a publisher and various other districts officials complained about the Wit and Wisdom process, that it seemed unfair, and it became was highlighted to the state assembly. The House passed Public Chapter 770, stripping Penny Schwinn her waiver authority, and also stripped her from being a voting member of the Textbook Commission. And then House Bill 507 followed later on, which made the waivers dissolve, or stated that the waivers will dissolve on 1 January of 2023. So the bottom line is that our lawmakers acknowledge that the textbook adoption process for Wit and Wisdom was fatally flawed, that we have failed materials in 33 school districts from Wit and Wisdom alone. They acknowledge that these waivers were not valid, and those waivers will dissolve January of 2023. If you look at the Williamson County Schools waiver application, under what is your rationale for requesting this waiver? Quote, if we adopt this resource, we will supplement K through 2 with the TDOE, foundational skills curriculum, or foundations. Now, we know later on that they decided that they'd rather have the free material than pay for foundations, and that's exactly what they did. So there is a financial incentive right there. So from the state level, why the push for Wit and Wisdom? Well, there's SCORE. Tennessee SCORE has been pushing Wit and Wisdom since 2015, piloting it in Lift districts. Its revenue was $20.7 million in 2020. Johns Hopkins, the high-level reviewer that recommended the overriding of the failed second reviews, has ties to Great Minds, Wit and Wisdom, and Amplify CKLA. Great Minds, formerly Common Core Inc., until Common Core went out of style, changed their name to Great Minds LLC and then Great Minds PBC. So what's a PBC? It's a public benefit corporation. And I see in a lot of newspaper articles lately that they talk about the Washington, D.C.-based Great Minds nonprofit. Well, let's look at PBC. It's a term that has different meanings in different jurisdictions. In some cases, it is a traditional nonprofit, charity, or religious organization. In other locations, it is the term used for a newer form of for-profit corporation, most frequently called a benefit corporation. If the Tennessee education industry is a $7 billion a year industry, then I would submit that Great Minds is probably the latter. Also, the Gates Foundation. As of 2019, the Gates Foundation invested $34 million in Tennessee education, $17 million to SCORE. It's a donor to Johns Hopkins, Great Minds, Ed Reports, Chiefs for Change, Teen and TP, which is the New Teacher Project, Teach for America, and others. So at the county level, why Wit and Wisdom? First off, the free supplemental material. So that right there is a financial incentive in the form of a savings, not a payout, possibly to the tune of $1.5 million based on some of the numbers we've seen, and we have a FOIA request outstanding for that. Additionally, $16 to $18 per student was promised. That could be anywhere from $320,000 to roughly $396,000 for Williamson County schools. With a school district with a budget of $400 million, it's not a lot, but it is still money. Another reason that we asked Moms for Liberty is met with almost every board member and asked them point blank, why Wit and Wisdom? Why did you vote for it? And the most oft given reason is, quote, it was highly rated by edreports.org. More on that. And furthermore, could it be ideology? So we've heard a lot of buzzwords, social emotional learning, trauma-informed pedagogy, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, anti-racist teaching. It's all the buzz these days, and perhaps that was an incentive for Wit and Wisdom, since Wit and Wisdom seems to embrace those things. Let's take a closer look at Great Minds. If you attended our CRT 101 event, you know the buzzwords to look for, or the concerning words to look for. But from the Great Minds website, principal values Wit and Wisdom as part of her school's anti-racist approach. In the body, it talks about an anti-racist approach to education. Let's talk about the definition of anti-racism, and this is from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Quote, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So you're answering wrongs with wrongs. That is what anti-racism is. Anti-racism is another word for racism. Furthermore, Wit and Wisdom specifically cites social emotional learning, and I think we've seen that evidence in play on this today. Now, Let's look at edreports.org, the one that highly rated Wit and Wisdom. Ed Reports, diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity belief statement for incorporating diversity, inclusion, and equity. Now, if you attended CRT 101, you know full well what diversity, equity, inclusion really mean. They are critical race theory. While the words sound nice, they do not, as defined in these contexts, they don't lead to unity of any sort, diversity of thought, or equality. This is from Eric Hirsch, Executive Director of Ed Reports. He talks about systemic racism in our educational system and country. Ed Reports has initiated a 3-year plan to embed diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity in all we do, and talks about their commitment to equity. Let's talk about the Gates Foundation in Tennessee to the tune of $34 million. The State Collaborative on Reforming Education, SCORE, received $17 million over the last 10 years. SCORE pushed Wit and Wisdom. Great Minds. The Gates Foundation has given donations to Great Minds PBC since 2008 when it was Common Core Inc. Those donations started at $285,000 and now the company is valued at $66.8 million. Donations the Gates Foundation has donated to edreports.org. Ed Reports pushed Wit and Wisdom. They called it highly rated. Johns Hopkins received donations from the Gates Foundation as well, and Johns Hopkins covered for Wit and Wisdom. And then donations to Chiefs for Change. They are, quote, leaders of state and district education, often facilitating public-private partnerships, of which Schwinn is a board member. So the bottom line is, in this whole self-licking ice cream cone of money changing hands, where's the kids? Where is the emphasis put on the student sitting at a desk with this information in front of them, being told about how bad their country is, their skin color, the church, with dark imagery, age-inappropriate content that's taking a psychological toll on them? Where is the child in that whole process? Moms for Liberty, our take. Wit and Wisdom is social emotional learning with pockets of implicit critical race theory. It is not end-to-end critical race theory, but the tenets of it do exist, especially in Grade 2, Module 3. Wit and Wisdom never actually passed a single state textbook review. Again, I watched the work session from June 17th, and Wit and Wisdom never actually passed a single state textbook review. And that is what is in before Williamson County kids. Do not Williamson County children deserve the best? Do they not deserve a curriculum that passed the first round with flying colors? The potential detrimental effects of Wit and Wisdom on young minds is without question, and we have multiple documented cases of that. We have instances of kids in counseling receiving psychological help for the damage inflicted on them by the curriculum taught in a Williamson County elementary school. The educational industrial complex is big business to the tune of $7 billion per year in Tennessee. The evidence of money, not what's best for the children, being the driving factor behind Wit and Wisdom is overwhelming, to say nothing of the ideology behind the money. What ultimately matters, the only thing that matters, is our children. All we want is a safe, happy, joyful learning experience for the children. Children should have a love of learning and not dread going to school. To recap, this is what we covered. You as a parent equipped with this information, it's up to you what you do with it. You as a parent, a grandparent, a citizen, you're free to draw your own conclusions. Most of this information was not known or well known. It took the Wit and Wisdom Deep Dive Committee hours and hours of research and digging to pull this stuff up, but we wanted to make it known to you, the parents and grandparents. Again, over 15 parents of Moms for Liberty invested over 1,200 hours of their time to bring it to light. Our goal today is not to tell you what to think, but to inform and empower the parents. What you do with that information is up to you. Again, I want to thank you for your time.